Let me welcome everybody to this second in a series of lectures organized as part of the Association for Archaeological Research in Western Asia, ARWA. And this is the Archaeology in Action series devoted to art history and visual studies. And I'm thrilled to be able to introduce today's speaker, a colleague and friend for many years, Dr. Michael Seymour. I'm sure will be known to many of you, but he's the Associate Curator in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He completed his PhD at University College London and worked for the British Museum in the Department of the Middle East before joining the Met in 2011. His research has focused on the later reception and representation of ancient West Asia, particularly the city of Babylon. And I'm sure many of you, in fact, all of you will probably know his wonderful book on that subject. He also focuses on the early history of archaeology in Iraq and Mesopotamian art of the first millennium BC and early century C. Is currently part of a team working on the complete renovation and redesign of the Met's galleries for ancient Near Eastern and Cypriot art. And the new galleries are scheduled to open in 2026, and we're all eagerly awaiting that. So without further ado, my thanks to you, Michael, for accepting this invitation to speak, and delighted to hear about The Prince, Human and Object Biographies in an Assyrian Relief Fragment. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Thank you for the kind invitation, and thank you everyone for joining today. As you've just heard, my focus at the moment is certainly with my whole department and many others, this big redesign of the Met's galleries for ancient Near Eastern art and for Cypriot art, which is part of the Greek and Roman department. That kind of complete renovation of a department's entire suite of galleries really doesn't come around often. It may well be a once-in-a-career project, but it's a huge opportunity to think about new narratives, to really think about the stories we're trying to tell. And that certainly includes trying to talk more about the long lives of objects, their ancient but also their modern stories. And so I thought today I would pick a relief that's very much in that frame that I've been thinking about in that gallery's context, and to go back to some of the existing work that's been done on it and try and tease out some of the ancient and modern questions. On another level, because my interests have mostly centered on Babylon, in Assyrian art, I'm most interested in the places where Assyria and Babylonia meet. I've done some work on campaign reliefs, particularly those showing southern campaigns, trying to think through for myself what was innovative in late Assyrian campaign reliefs and what light the choices that were made in them might shed on Babylonia and the conflicts between the two. Now, the relief I'm talking about today, I think, does relate to those conflicts, but perhaps in a more complex way than the campaign reliefs. It's this fragment of a bearded figure, and my hope today is to try and unpack what we currently understand about the ancient and modern stories of the relief, how those stories fit together, and finally, how I hope we might be able to present it in the redesigned galleries. As you'll see, in some ways I still have more questions than answers, but I hope it'll be an interesting journey. And I'm also hoping to enlist this group in looking for ideas and solutions I might have missed and ways to proceed and find out more. So the relief comes from the Southwest Palace at Nineveh. We suspect possibly from a passage leading to the Ishtar Temple, but we'll come back to that. And it's one of a large group, including a majority of Assyrian reliefs at the Met, that has traveled a very complex and interesting route together. I'm sure this group is aware of John Malcolm Russell's Wonderful from Nineveh to New York that tells that story in depth, and I won't try to summarize it all here. I'll just try to mention a couple of the key moments. The story begins at Nineveh, of course, in northern Iraq, and today that means the center of modern Mosul. So if I just pick out roughly the area of the outer city walls there, and then zoom in a little to the highlighted area here is the Mount of Kuyunjik, and the Southwest Palace, of course, is the bottom corner of that red shape in this image. Now, Mosul in the 1840s was much smaller, and I like this view because it shows a view across the Tigris from what was then Mosul on one bank of the river to the mounds of Kuyunjik and Nebi Yunus, the mounds of Nineveh on the other bank, well, past the other bank. And as we know, we're talking about the 1840s and early 1850s, and the methods of excavation were extremely crude by modern standards. Reliefs were cut down, particularly with the removal of their backs to reduce their weight, and then most commonly floated down the river Tigris on rafts to Baghdad and eventually Basra, where they could be loaded onto ships. Now, most of the reliefs excavated by Layard at Nimrud and Nineveh went to the British Museum, but some sculptures were given to his cousin and patron, Lady Charlotte Guest, and her husband, the industrialist Sir John Guest. At their stately home in Dorset, Camford Manor, today Canford School, the reliefs, as well as a colossal winged bull and lion, were installed in a specially built Victorian Gothic folly called the Nineveh Porch. And that's actually, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this smaller area over here, I think my next slide goes in closer, so toward the right hand of this image. Sadly, we don't have photos of the porch with the sculptures installed, but in his research, John Malcolm Russell used a combination of traces of their mounting in the building itself and an inventory made by L.W. King to reconstruct with a fair degree of confidence the original positioning of the reliefs within the court. So here that top image is the north wall and the bottom image is the south wall, and you can see the likely arrangement of reliefs. In 1919, Charlotte Guest's grandson, Ivor Churchill Guest, sold most of the reliefs. They were purchased by the art dealer Dikran Kalikian, who in turn hoped to find an American buyer who would be interested in their biblical significance and perhaps in making them a grand donation to one of the country's growing museums. From the start, he thought that a prime candidate would be John D. Rockefeller Jr., but at first he was very unsuccessful in his pursuit of Rockefeller. Kalikian shipped the sculptures to the United States, and for a while even displayed them at the University Museum of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, still hoping to attract a buyer. Over time, Rockefeller did become more interested, partly because of his religious and related archaeological interests that were burgeoning in other areas. He was already giving major support to American engagement in Near Eastern archaeology, most notably in the creation of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, which has just been renamed the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. But I promise not to try and do the whole of from Nineveh to New York, so I'll spoil the ending. It took 10 years, but in the end, Rockefeller did buy the sculptures from Kalikian, and did so planning to give them to an institution where they could be seen by the public. He consulted scholars, including James Henry Breasted, on their scholarly and artistic value, and crucially, on where they should go. He seriously considered both Chicago and Philadelphia as the ultimate destinations of the reliefs. Having consulted, he in the end settled on the Met for two reasons. First, he understood that the standard inscription of Ashurnasirpal, borne by the majority of the sculptures, was quite well known, he'd concluded that the significance in that sense was more public and artistic than philological. But it was also clear to him that they would be seen at the Met by the largest possible public, and that was something that was important to him. Another reason that I think is really interesting is that there was an awareness of trying to bring what we today maybe call ancient West Asia into the universal art museum that the Met was trying to become. And there's already by that date a small group of Assyrian reliefs, as well as some tablets and seals in the collection, but it's really quite limited. And there is an argument to make that Rockefeller's gift was a major factor in the growth of what eventually became today's two departments of ancient Near Eastern and Islamic art. Most of the Assyrian sculptures, as you can see in this image, were from the Northwest Palace at Nimrud. And of course, it's those that comprise the Assyrian sculpture court. I should say this is more or less how the gallery appears today, but because we've just closed for the big renovation project, we hope to keep the sculptures in place as they are. There will be changes around them. But this basic arrangement hopefully will stay. There are also a few fragments from Khorsabad and Nineveh, and I just wanted to go to a couple of slightly older photos that show where the Crown Prince was positioned. This was roughly how it looked at the time I arrived at the museum in 2011. So you see this wall around the corner from the Assyrian sculpture court, and the relief we're looking at is high up on the wall here. The main draw of that area in the galleries used to be the siege scene below, because biblical groups, and there are a lot of large Jehovah's Witness groups that come to the museum, used it as a sort of a proxy, a place to focus on the siege of Lachish and the siege of Jerusalem. So that was really what was animating things for people in that space at the time. And I think it's quite hard when you have the Assyrian sculpture court next door to know how best to display these smaller reliefs from a different city with a lot of different issues about them. So you probably won't be surprised that I think this one deserves more attention. And in fact, it's already getting it. Now that the galleries are closed, it's part of a major 2-year loan to the National Museum of Korea in Seoul, who have produced a wonderful Mesopotamian exhibition based on objects borrowed from the Met. Meanwhile, for our purposes today, we can virtually bring it down from the wall ourselves and take a closer look too. So we've seen that it's the upper part of a bearded male figure. And if I start from the top, he's wearing a princely diadem. You can see some of the patterning on it, some of the rosettes, some of that is lost, with a long streamer at the back. He's wearing large, elaborate earrings, a little like some of those that were found at the Queen's tombs at Nimrud. And although the surface of the relief is quite worn and eroded, you can still see how large parts of the clothing were covered in fine incised detail representing patterning and embroidery. And I know Amy Gansel spoke last week, so I won't try to dive into clothing. Just as a comparator, here's the incredibly well-preserved Ashurbanipal costume from one of the lion hunt scenes in the British Museum. So it's that kind of patterning. He wears large armbands and bracelets, presumably gold originally, and comparison with other Assyrian reliefs makes it clear that the face of the visible bracelet would have been a rosette. And he carries a sword tucked through his clothing with 2 lions on the scabbard and a large tassel hanging down from the center. And all of that is what was originally carved, but there are other details we should take note of too. The whole surface is somewhat eroded, but that wear and weathering seems to be worse in the lower part of the relief, including at the very bottom edge, which I'll come back to. More dramatically, the damage to the figure's face is deliberate. The nose is smashed, and hopefully you can see quite a sharp line running through the lips that I think is very deliberate. That damage was almost certainly done in the immediate aftermath of the fall of Nineveh in 612 BC, when many images, particularly of kings, were treated similarly. And I'll just show a couple of the most famous examples. Of course, Sennacherib, the siege of Lachish, and Ashurbanipal in the banquet scene, and in fact also the queen, I think is probably Libalishara. You can see both their faces and Ashurbanipal's bowl, and even some of the faces of the other figures in this scene. Now, in all these cases, we're looking not at simple destruction, but at a nullification of power and agency in the image. It's one of those details that really supports the conception most forcefully argued by Zainab Bahrani, but I think widely shared, that Mesopotamian images act not simply as mimetic representations, but have ways of actively participating in the real, that an image is performing just by existing. And I think that these sort of focused acts of damage to royal figures should be understood in that light. And all that, of course, isn't actually the main damage or the main change from this relief's original appearance, because where is the rest of the relief? Like so many examples in museums around the world, this fragment must have been cut down from a larger panel. So we'll come back to that. Despite a lack of documentation, we can reconstruct a lot about the likely original location of the relief. Laird's excavations at Nineveh focused on the Southwest Palace, and I'm sure that is where it was found. There's a great comparator in Berlin, and when Julian Reed studied the relief in the 1960s, he realized that the Met fragment may well have come from the other side of the same passage where these were found, running between the palace and the Ishtar Temple. Now, this relief is both much more complete and much better preserved than the one in the Metropolitan Museum. So it's useful to take a look at that too. So these are just my own photos, but even in these you can see the diadem with the rosettes and hopefully the detailed patterning of the figure's clothing. We can also see some of the context. It's part of a procession. Other parts of that procession survive. And we should probably understand the figures immediately behind the one we're focused on, also as royal figures, as possibly princes. You can see, if I zoom in on a close-up, that the other figures in this scene, and I should say, we can't, it's kind of hard to tell because of the other damage to the main figure. But it seems to me that the other figures in this procession have deliberate damage to the fronts of their faces also. So all of that is very helpful and hopeful. It does seem plausible that the Met relief might originally have come from the other side of this passageway, where we know that the remains of the procession were much more fragmentary and damaged. However, that's kind of where the problems begin. As Julian Reed himself pointed out, that passage would make great sense as a suggested find spot, but Layard didn't actually dig there. It was only uncovered slightly later by Hormuzd Rassam. Reed concluded that Layard probably found the fragment in a secondary context in another part of the palace. Another possibility to consider would be that Rassam might have been the excavator, and Russell looked into this. And although he was able to find one Rassam letter of 1852 actually offering to send additional reliefs to Layard in England, it doesn't seem as though anything came of that. There's nothing after that. Rassam had visited Canford before the Nineveh porch was built. Charlotte Guest described his visit in a diary entry, and he did give Nimrud relief fragments to both Magdalen, the college he attended while he was in Oxford, and Christ Church College at the University of Oxford. If it did happen, I would be surprised that that Russell didn't find mention of it either in Layard's papers or Charlotte Guest's diary, or even that Rassam himself doesn't make mention of it in his archaeological memoir, Ashur and the Land of Nimrud. He did write a fuller memoir that sadly is lost, so that's another tantalizing part of the puzzle. But Rassam did care about recognition, particularly later in his life after his very bruising conflict with Wallace Budge, who had damaged his reputation to the point that Rassam was compelled to sue Budge for libel. And at the very end of his life in 1910, Rassam wrote to Magdalen College in Oxford to ask why his gift of the relief was no longer acknowledged in the accompanying plaque. There's one other Canford relief also at the Met with a comparable problem. In this case, the imagery suggests that maybe the best parallels are in the North Palace, which was excavated by Rassam from December 1853 onward. In that case, though, the dates don't really work. The most intense period of activity on the Nineveh porch seems to have been 1853 going into 54, and the planning and shipments of objects, therefore, significantly earlier. You already have to imagine a very narrow window for Rassam to have contributed to the project at all. And even the Southwest Palace tunnel idea is only just plausible in that sense. I think the North Palace is too late. Layard wrote a letter to his friend, the merchant Henry Ross, at Kuyunjik, asking to send Nimrud and Nineveh slabs for Canford. And that letter comes from March 1848. The letter is detailed and specific on the particular reliefs from Nimrud Layard was identifying as suitable for Canford. But of Nineveh, he simply says, quote, "If you could secure me a specimen or two from Kuyunjik with horses, chariots, or anything in that line, pray add them to the above. The whole to be sawed and packed as mine were. Only remember never to put matting in any position where it may come in contact with the sculptured face of the slab as it marks the marble." So all of which makes me think that Reed's suggestion that the relief was found out of place is probably right. Rassam describes one side of the passage to the Ishtar Temple as very badly disturbed, so something had happened there prior to the mid-19th century. However, that only raises a new problem. As I mentioned, the relief was cut down, which is something we associate with the 19th century and individual reliefs that were given or sold in the second half of the 19th century. And it had to do with portrait heads, both from the perspective of them being easier to transport and to sort of perhaps suit a Western collector's taste. I'm not sure how often Layard himself did that in terms of the sculptures that went to the British Museum, but the letter shows that he expected Ross to for this project. It may be partly about context. A few of the Canford relief fragments are cut down to neat squares and rectangles, But for those going to the British Museum, it doesn't seem to have been Layard's usual practice, even when reliefs were already very fragmentary. So that's interesting. So was the Prince relief moved in antiquity and then cut down? The stranger part, as I mentioned, seems to be the pattern of weathering. And it does seem to be the bottom edge that that is most eroded. That would imply that it was exposed to the elements for some time after it was cut away from a larger relief. And I'm really struggling to understand how that can be. Reed's thought was that the weathering might reflect the stone having been reused upside down, which makes sense. But I'm bothered by the neatness of the iconography preserved and the portrait-like composition, all of which looks very deliberate, very much with a view to sending this as an art object. So my current tentative opinion is that the relief was damaged and this part of it moved before the 19th century, presumably later in antiquity at any date after the sack of Nineveh in 612 BC, since the damage to the face strongly suggests that it was still in its original place then. Layard's letter to Henry Ross also asks for the assistance of a Syriac Christian stonemason named Bainan, who Layard had previously relied on and who he describes in Nineveh and its remains as, quote, a skillful marble cutter and a very intelligent man, unquote. The Prince, I don't think, came in that shipment from Ross. There are descriptions of that shipment's contents in Lady Charlotte's diary, again noted by Russell, that almost rule that out. But it gives us a little insight into the approach, and it shows that Layard was ready to cut down sculptures for the purpose. My guess is that this figure was already in a secondary context, but not as the neat composition we see today, and that the latter is the result of a stonemason, possibly even Bainan himself, cutting down at least the sides and top, I'm not sure about the bottom, before it was sent to Camford. So one nice aspect of the galleries project is that there should be lots of opportunities between now and the reopening for scientific research. In this case, my thought at the moment is that when the relief returns to the US from Korea, we might request RTI analysis to look at tool marks on all four sides and see whether there's anything interesting and meaningful to find there. But I'd love ideas on how to investigate this further. So all of that is the modern puzzle, and there's an equally intriguing ancient one. I talked through the iconography, which for this period is very consistent with other images of a crown prince. The main exceptions are images of Ashurbanipal hunting when it seems that as king, he sometimes wears the diadem that we otherwise associate with the crown prince. But I think we're on solid ground in saying that the crown prince is very likely the correct identification based on others that are clearer in context, including of Ashurbanipal himself as crown prince on Esarhaddon and Sinjili Stele. We can compare lots of other images, but I love the famous images of probably Sennacherib as crown prince of Sargon. This one at the Louvre. Again, these are just my own photos, but I happened to be there on a day in 2019 when the natural light was really bringing out the reds of Sargon's crown, and you can see very clearly the pupils. And here the other figure, who I would say is the crown prince Sennacherib. But all of the figures I've shown you, this prince, the figures in Berlin, the Met relief, have that finely incised decoration on large parts of their clothing, and it's worth just stressing that that is unusual overall. It's certainly not confined to the senior royalty. It's common on the potential crown prince images, in Ashurnasirpal reliefs, on a lot of the beardless figures in those reliefs. But it's closer to the detailed patterns we see in king's clothing than the simpler treatment of most figures, even when those figures are rendered at very large scale. So Reed was similarly confident that the relief represented a crown prince under Sennacherib, but which one? Esarhaddon, of course, was not always crown prince, and he stresses that as a younger son, the nature of his ascent to the throne was somewhat unusual. Sennacherib's eldest son was Ashur-nadin-shumi. We don't know for sure that he was the crown prince. The main reason for caution is that we know there are plenty of cases where it doesn't go to the oldest son, where neither Sennacherib nor Esarhaddon nor Ashurbanipal are oldest sons. So the crown prince did not have to be. However, my opinion is that the circumstantial evidence does point to Ashur-nadin-shumi. It's after his death that the second son, Ardal-Melissu, is made crown prince. Before that position is usurped by his younger brother Esarhaddon. And Esarhaddon's own inscriptions, as I've said, implied that the expectation was that kingship would not go to a younger son. While as king, his creation of Ashurbanipal as king of Assyria and his older brother Shamash-shum-ukin as king of Babylon is explicitly a novel solution to the problem of repeated Babylonian rebellions. I think Sennacherib's placement of his oldest son, Ashur-nadin-shumi, on the throne of Babylon was an earlier novel solution to the same problem. There's one remarkable stele at the Ashmolean Museum that actually shows Ashur-nadin-shumi as king of Babylon in Babylonian dress, including the crown. I do think that he was also crown prince of Assyria. He's never named as such in the text, only as first son or preeminent son, but no other son seems to play remotely as prominent a role. And as I say, there's a new crown prince after his death. The problems with this political approach are shown up by Ashur-nadin-shumi's fate. He was taken prisoner and probably murdered in Elam in 694 BCE as part of the great Elamite revolt against Assyria that led a year later to Sennacherib's punitive destruction of the city of Babylon. That exceptional event seems to have been so sacrilegious that Sennacherib's successors avoided referring to it directly, preferring to present it as divine wrath and kind of natural disaster. Sennacherib himself, though, could not have been more clear. So, quoting Brinkman's translation, he tells us, quote, "I destroyed the city and its houses from foundation to parapet. I devastated and burned them. I razed the brick and earthwork of the outer and inner wall of the city, of the temples, and of the ziggurat, and I dumped these into the Urartu Canal. I dug canals through the midst of the city. I overwhelmed it with water. I made its very foundations disappear, and I destroyed it more completely than a devastating flood, so that it might be impossible in future days to recognize the site of that city and its temples. I utterly dissolved it with water and made it like inundated land." Now, we can be a bit dry about these things, and of course, geopolitics isn't just the king's id, but in this case, I do think it's worth stressing that from Sennacherib's perspective, his son has just been murdered. I suspect he had also lost his crown prince, which might have been a factor later in exacerbating the succession struggles that would ultimately bring Esarhaddon to the throne. It seems likely to me that Esarhaddon looked at the fate of Ashur-nadin-shumi and the danger of leaving the first in line to the throne in the potentially rebellious city of Babylon, and took that lesson on board when designing a different system to solve the problem of the Babylonian kingship. Now, the final part of the puzzle is the date. There's now been a lot more work on the dates of construction of the Southwest Palace, again, much of it by Russell. And much as Layard and Charlotte Guest's archival sources help narrow the likely time frame for the completion of the Nineveh court at Camford, so on a grander scale, the Assyrian correspondence strongly indicates that the years of activity in Sennacherib's reign on the palace were circa 701 to 700 through 694, 693 BCE. That also roughly matches the content of the relief, since as far as we've been able to tell at present, none of the Sennacherib campaign scenes there depict events later than the 5th campaign. That is, they seem to show events up to around 699, 698 BC. Further extensive programs of reliefs were added in later generations by Ashurbanipal and possibly by Sin-Shar-Ishkun. And of course, we don't know what has not survived or what was replaced by those kings. But the numerous surviving reliefs of Sennacherib's reign do seem to fall in that fairly narrow window. And that probable narrower time frame, particularly the end of the correspondence in around 694, helps us a lot, because it confines the activity to the period before the death of Ashur-nadin-Shumi. I realize that's a combination of two probablys, but I do think it's enough to suggest that Ashur-nadin-Shumi is the name we should attach to this relief. And names are important from a museum perspective. There's a world of difference, even if we're tentative about it, between the image of a prince, a figure, and being able to tie our story to a specific historical person who we can place in their time. It's obviously an amazing thing when that's possible. Even having a name to attach is extremely humanizing and helps people see a real living world beyond the ancient sculptures. My inclination is to start calling this an Assyrian crown prince, probably or possibly Ashur-nadin-Shumi. Incidentally, the same probably applies to the scene I showed earlier from the Siege of Lachish. In that case, even the event depicted is clearly earlier than Ashur-nadin-Shumi's death, which is another sort of maybe layer of confidence one could add. To finish, I just want to talk for a moment about how we might present this relief in the redesigned galleries. I won't show any of the architect's renders, as everything is still really in development. Although if you go to the project website, you can see a great lecture by the lead architect, Nader Tehrani, of the Boston-based firm Nadar, not only on the project so far, but also on the practice and philosophy that drives it from a design and architectural standpoint. So instead of that, I'll just talk about the narrative. I hope I'm convincing you of how interesting the relief is and how it speaks to multiple stories, ancient and modern. And I also hope that you'll feel my pain as I face up to the reality that museum labels really do have to be short, and that we might be doing this in, in 100 words. There's also a constraint that is obvious, but really conceptually important. Unlike a lecture or an article, we're talking about one real physical object that will sit in one physical place in the galleries. Oh, I'm sorry. In general, in this project, we're trying to respond to the collection as it is, not so much to try to give a complete picture of what we just don't have, but to sort of lean into the peculiarities of the collection that we do. We talk about moving from the model of a textbook with its sense of overarching completeness to one of an anthology, in which we see many individual stories in a constellation, structured in the way they connect to one another. There's actually still a loose chronological order at the heart of it, but really able to act more individually, to meet the visitor wherever they are, wherever they start, with an interesting story that hopefully connects to the stories and objects around it, rather than asking them to take a course from intro wall A to Sasanian stucco Z. In the case of the prince, I think it might be very interesting to make him part of a story that's quite ancient focused, and one we're quite well equipped to address, about the discomfort of the imperial relationship between Assyria and Babylonia, and ultimately about the transition of power from one to the other. Of course, that means making choices. We we'll plan to include provenance of all the objects in their labels as we do for their web labels, but the more narrative treatments of the modern history will probably happen in the Assyrian sculpture court itself and in another gallery that's actually focused on histories of collecting and histories of reception. Other objects that might fit into the ancient story include this fragmentary prism of Esarhaddon. Again, thinking of the specificity of objects, when you display something like this, do you privilege the hieroglyphs at the end or the text of the inscription itself? In this context, I think the latter, and it's fascinating. First, we see and somewhat embarrassed Esarhaddon delicately avoiding the deeds of his father, talking about the destruction of Babylon simply in terms of divine will. Here from the same prism, presenting himself as the good ruler, the restorer of lands, of livelihoods, of sacred spaces. Another interesting document is what at least purports to be a later copy of a letter found in Esagila, Babylon, from Sin-Sharash-Kun of Assyria to Nabopolassar of Babylon. Written as the scale of the Babylonian threat and the imminent collapse of the Assyrian Empire are becoming clear, it does the unthinkable, acknowledges the Babylonian Nabopolassar as the senior king. Now, again, I should stress this is it's a later tablet, but it's a very interesting one. We have objects that speak to the destruction of the Assyrian palaces themselves. The Met is fortunate to have received a part of the division of finds from the 20th century excavations at Nimrud, and in particular, a large group of Nimrud ivories. This is one of several fire-damaged ivories from the Temple of Nabu at Nimrud. I should mention here that Paul has actually just published a great essay on this very group in the Festschrift for Georgina Hermann. And finally, what we might think of as the beginning of a new imperial cycle. Nebuchadnezzar, having seen for himself the sudden destruction of a centuries-old empire and its capitals, setting out to prevent the same thing from happening to him. This text is about the building and strengthening of Babylon's fortifications, the massive Imgur Enlil inner wall, and the new outer city walls enclosing a much larger area of the city. In this context, the prince represents both the visual expression of Assyrian royal power and, in the damage to its face, the deliberate negation of that power, even in the image itself. If I'm right, and the relief does represent Ashur-nadin-Shumi, there's a whole other layer of connection there. An Assyrian prince who was made king of Babylon and ultimately paid for that with his life. The last slide I'll show, though, takes us on a bit of a turn. All of this will probably not take center stage in that section of the galleries. In fact, it definitely won't. We've been talking a lot about empire, the constraints of our material, which tends to tilt so heavily toward imperial elites, to the almost subconscious constraints of a sort of canon of ancient Near Eastern art that we've surely been part of forming. So we're planning to do, I think, quite a bold thing. One of the excavations in which the Met was particularly involved was at Hassan Lu in Iran. The site is not that famous, certainly not by comparison with Nineveh and Babylon, and it doesn't seem to have been fully under either Assyrian or Iraqi control, but it was wedged between the two and eventually violently destroyed and burned. I think people now think most probably by an Iraqi army. These are burned ivories from the site, and there are many other objects that have that kind of poignancy, as well as much more everyday things, or things that can tell us about Hassan Lu as a living place in its own right, for its own sake, and not really in relation to the empires around it. So we're going to put that material in as a rupture, a big visually interesting installation right in the middle of the space, to kind of try and visually and materially insist on talking about empire, not only in terms of kings, great powers, and geopolitics, but also, and perhaps primarily, in terms of how it all affects all those people who aren't kings and princes. On the curatorial side, my colleague Sarah Graf is leading on that part of the project, And on the architectural side, Nada have produced wonderful ideas that we hope are going to make that story really impactful visually and experientially. It's a part of the project we're all very excited about and crucial context for our prints. I wonder if Ashur-nadin Shumi, who ultimately lost his own life in imperial power struggles, I wonder how he would see such an arrangement. I can't finish without thanking Paul Collins for the generous invitation to present, all my colleagues in the Department of Ancient Near Eastern Art at the Met for being so supportive of my running off and doing this when we're at a critical stage of the gallery design project. Kim Benzel, curator in charge of our department, has been leading us very boldly and superbly. And in collaboration with the Met's leadership, its great capital projects team, the Department of Greek and Roman Art, with whom we're collaborating to try and connect the ancient Near Eastern and Cypriot galleries, and Nader Tehrani and his outstanding team at Nada, whose creativity and thoughtfulness will be there for everyone to see in the redesigned galleries. And finally, thank you all very much for bearing with me and listening. You've been very kind to indulge me as I talk this all through, and I'm extremely grateful for any ideas and suggestions. Thank you so much.
Michael, thank you very much indeed for that wonderful talk, intersecting ancient stories, modern ideas, and look forward to the future of where Ashur-nadin Shumi, shall we call him, might eventually end up in part of your storytelling. So thank you for that terrific story. I'm sure it's will have generated all sorts of interesting thoughts, both ancient and modern. So if you could now stop sharing, we'll hopefully spend a few minutes just allowing people to, well, I've seen lots of virtual clapping, which is one of the, you can't hear it, but one of the things, the issues with Zoom, but it's certainly there very visibly. So now I'd like to invite everybody to ask questions if they have any, and Joanne is first to raise her hand. So please go ahead. Hang on, we need to unmute you. You should be able to unmute yourself. Can you do that? Let me see if I have the power.
Yes, okay, success. Okay, we've got it now. Wonderful lecture, really enjoyed it. And yes, you've convinced me. That's Ashur-nadin Shumi. It's wonderful. It's a wonderful story. The one thing I wanted to say, though, was in terms of the treatment of, this sort of saying that Babylon is the wrath of Marduk and so forth, to know is that trope is actually cited by the early Neo-Babylonian kings. And they cite it for a reason. And the reason all this fuss is being made is that if you destroy a god and his sanctuary and his thing, he's gone forever. If somebody foreign does it, okay, then he's gone, he's dead, he's out of it, he no longer exists. Whereas if he destroys his own sanctuary in anger, and there's a precedent for this because there was an imagining of Enlil and some of the other gods destroying their own sanctuaries, and they just go off and pout in the netherworld for a while, and then they can eventually return. So framing it that way actually made it possible for Esarhaddon to restore Marduk. And the same sort of trope is indirectly referenced in Ashurbanipal's when he destroys Babylon and then rebuilds it. It's again, there's a lot of citations from from these sort of Marduk tropes that run all the way through his. That it also suggests that it is Marduk himself who did the destruction and caused people to starve and all this other horrible things that happen. that this was actually because of Marduk's wrath, and that Ashurbanipal was merely a prince delegated to do the damage. And the same trope, by the way, shows up in the Aramaic Targum of Lamentations for Yahweh in Jerusalem.
Are you not able to, what, I'm not sure what's going on here. Let me see if I can. Everyone should be technically able to unmute themselves, but let me see if I can.
Thank you. It says the host is not allowing participants to unmute themselves. It's very, it's blaming you. It's making a thank you very much. That's an extremely helpful point. I mean, to me, it actually goes a little bit to what I really think of the campaign reliefs, because I think there's it's so easy to slip into this view of them as just sort of purely propagandistic or purely, these bombastic things, and all these decisions actually have to be made with, real religious considerations behind them. So it seems to me, thank you. That's a great point.
And there is a question from Henry, and I hope you are able to unmute. Let me see if I can do that for you. Yeah.
Hello, Michael. Great talk as always. I turned my video on, but I guess the host isn't allowing that either.
I apologize. I have no idea how I have that power, but
It's these high security settings, which I wish I'd known about when I started teaching on Zoom during the pandemic. But that's fine. Michael knows what I look like. This is I really like this, and this your discussion, especially of the damage to the relief, made me think of another sort of area of intersection in the galleries, and I'm guessing you've thought about this too, but it therefore intersects pretty directly with the Elamite material, even if some of the memory serves, much of the Elamite material that you have is much earlier, second millennium. But if this damage results from the sack of Nineveh, there are Elamites directly involved in that, and so it's a sort of a nice way to tie those two seemingly disparate bodies of material in the museum together. And in fact, there's also sort of a third connection that you could draw there as well, that you could actually tie it in some way to the Persians as well, not because they're necessarily at the sack of Nineveh, but because Persian ethnogenesis occurs in sort of the context of the Elamites and the Medes who were involved. And if we're sort of setting aside the difficult question of saying who is a Persian in the 7th century BC, before we have any texts that refer to that, some people who might have thought of themselves as Persians may have in fact participated in that sack sort of as Medes, depending on how that all worked out. So this got me thinking about these sorts of possibilities for intersections in the reinstallation, and I think it's very exciting.
Oh no, I see what you mean. Sorry, Joanne, you were.
Yeah. Yes, I wanted to sort of second that very much. You know about the Sargon Head, the damage that was done to it, the famous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It has been argued, and I have seen that in print, that this is actually a Persian method of execution.
Yeah. Carl Nylander made that argument.
Actually on the thing. So yes. What's the other thing just to mention is that there are two sets of damage. Actually, I did some work on this. There was an iconoclasm thing, and I did an article in that iconoclasm volume. It was edited by Natalie May, and that talks about the Assyrian reliefs and what happened, and so forth. And there's two sets of damage. Actually, there's the really violent damage, which just like hacks the whole face out. And that was done by Babylonians and by Elamites, because the people who are hacked out are people who are on the wrong side of various Elamite little quarrels. There's a pro-Teomon faction, let's put it that way, among the Elamites. And so Urtaka just gets his face completely obliterated on the release. But the Medes do damage as well, but it's much more subtle. The Median damage is much more what Zainab was talking about, of trying to negate the power of the image to affect you for damaging it. You know, and it's very subtle. You almost in places can't see it, the damage of it. So, you know, it takes out the eyes, you know, it'll cut off a wrist. It will do things like that, but it's a very delicate, it's a really delicate damage. And in some cases you have to actually look, you know, you think the thing's undamaged, and then you look at it really, really carefully up close or in a super good photograph, and you can see that there's just a trace of damage in the eyes, and so forth. So it's an interesting thing that selective damage, and you can kind of fingerprint the person who actually did that, the group of people who will have done that particular damage and why.
The other thing is, of course, Cyrus is king of Anshan. And apparently Neo-Babylonian documents or say that he came in, he dressed in Elamite dress to enter Babylon. So there's some question, and also Cyrus is apparently
an Elamite name.
It's an Elamite name. So there's some question about whether Cyrus and Cambyses are Elamites or Persians. Obviously, Darius claims they're Persians, but it's a little bit questionable there.
And the answer is probably yes. Actually, the Arjan tomb has a really interesting sort of put together of Persian and Elamite elements in it. And a Persian nobleman, I mean, he's clearly a Persian nobleman. His badge of office is an Achaemenid style. But he's wearing Elamite court dress.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
It's very interesting. And actually coming back to the how might that work in physical galleries? You're gonna one product of that sort of rupture of Hassan Lu is that you'll have the kind of things Henry's thinking of maybe on one side of that divide, and on the other, pretty soon after, you have this focus on the kind of conscious construction of Achaemenid imperial art, and the sort of reconciling the multinational nature of that empire. I'm just sort of processing, but I see what you mean. And actually it goes to, I know I'm afraid Elizabeth had to go, but I saw her question in the chat about expanding on, you know, what do you do beyond that short label. We are pushing, begging for a lot of attention from our digital department for the online component of this. So that's certainly one part of the answer. Another part is maybe having a little bit more flexibility than we did before to, you know, to bring something in and do something in just in a case temporarily, and then move on and tell another story. So we're you know, we have a plan, but we're trying to make the physical design a little more flexible than it was before too. And fingers crossed.
How about an audio guide? That's what we did at the ISAC now, but museum is to put audio guides. And then what you can do, and you've seen this on exhibits as well, you know, there'll be a little marker on certain objects, and then you turn on your audio and it gives you the full story of that object.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, the Met has this sort of legacy of sort of generations of versions of the audio guide. It does, much of it exists. That's good. And obviously I don't know yet in what form, so I'm kind of hedging, but we will for sure be producing a lot of audio in the course of this for and around the galleries. So an audio guide or something very, very like it, I'm sure. Oh, Sarah, I see.
Yeah, hi, thank you. It was so great to hear that talk, and I'm so looking forward to, as I'm sure we all are, for the reinstallation. I was really struck by the 4 images you showed early on of the walls of the Canford structure, and I'm curious about the south wall that you showed, that door with all of those griffins kind of stacked one on top of another. Is that a 19th century creation, or was that a 19th century creation? And is there any space in the gallery to talk about, I mean, even from a destructive context, what's happened to that material? Because the object biography theme is one that is just, I think, so striking from a storytelling perspective. So I'm curious about if that door exists anywhere, what other information we might have about it, but also if there's a space in the galleries to include some of that type of objects or even storytelling lines.
That's a great point. And actually, it's interesting. I've not tried to go to Camford. I think I'm gonna. But I know that it was difficult. You know, for John Russell's book, Judith Mackenzie managed to go and take the photographs. So there are modern, color photographs of that door, say. And certainly some of that structure is still surviving. Some of the interior ceilings, there are photos from the 90s in Russell. But I think, it's funny that as we go back through, we have a lot of older, Paul and I were actually just talking about this just before we came online. We have a lot of older photography of different reinstallations in progress of the reliefs as they move around the building. But we don't, unless Yelena knows something I don't, Yelena Rakic, who really knows very well, who knows the history of the collection better than anyone. She, to my knowledge, we don't have sort of our own kind of Canford, sort of archival images, which is kind of interesting. It makes me, having started by saying I think I'm gonna, I wonder if I think maybe I'm gonna, maybe the museum could help. Is what I now think. Because you're right. It's and I think it comes back to moving away from the idea of the Assyrian sculpture court as this sort of, as purely, the illusion of the ancient room, and doing a lot more deconstruction of it and making people, trying to almost move between those two states of feeling the atmosphere of it and being conscious of it as a construction. And I think there's something in the actual original layout of it that obviously I don't think it was necessarily it'd be interesting. It's laid out in such a way that depending on where you're standing, you could make a case that you're supposed to be looking down the throne room in that view from Layard's Monuments of Nineveh. You could make a case, if you're inside, that you're in a reception room. There's certainly a sort of specific doorway that you're walking through that's a particular doorway. But then when you sort of, having been looking at the winged bull and lion as though they're at the end of the throne room, you can then sort of flip it and look at them as though they're the exterior, they're the entrance gate of the Ninurta Temple, and they've got the Ninurta Temple reliefs beside them that were clearly, we love the arrangement as it is, partly because there's some fluidity to the kind of space you're in. So I don't know how, but I'd like to combine that with some of that moving between ancient and modern in the new display.
Yeah, great, thanks. So exciting to see it.
May I ask a question around back to the relief panel? It's always struck me as being rather small. If it really was part of that Ishtar Temple procession, it seems to be just a completely different scale. So it does suggest that maybe it is coming from somewhere else.
It could be. I've tried to very, very roughly compare the measurements, and it sort of works, but okay. I agree, it's definitely a little off, and yeah, and it does seem totally possible that it could come from somewhere else. There's something attractive about the about sort of knowing from Hassan that tunnel was very disturbed, because that gives you a sort of some context for a fragment turning up elsewhere. But I think you're right, as far as I've kind of been able to gauge it, and I haven't done it very well, it does seem to be like a little bit, not quite as much as it looks, I think, because of the way it's cut, but a little bit smaller in scale.
Great. Well, Michael, thank you so much for this incredible talk. If there are no more questions from our audience, I'm afraid several people had to slip away, had other meetings apparently, but the core team stayed. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And of course, there'll be another talk next Friday. Tala Anderson will take us on another journey to royalty in Assyria, this time looking at divine kingship under Esarhaddon. So much to offer there, I'm sure. And it will be, of course, the same Zoom link as you've used today. So no changes there. So hope to see everyone then. But my thanks again to Michael. And I know all your colleagues outside that door are desperate to get you back in action in that redevelopment. So good luck with that. And thank you very much again. Okay.
Well, let's talk at the same time next week.
Same time next week. Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Michael.